The famine of Uzakaf, a pharaoh's hubris, and the seeds of collapse. The sun, God's unsettled sun. The year is roughly 2494 BCE. Imagine, if you will, the scorching Egyptian sun beating down on the Giza Plateau, the colossal pyramids of Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafra standing as silent, imposing sentinels to a past era of unparalleled power and prosperity. You, a humble scribe or a common laborer, would be keenly aware of these monumental achievements, even as your own stomach grumbled with an unfamiliar ache. This was the dawn of the 5th dynasty, and at its helm sat Uzakaf, the first pharaoh, to explicitly declare himself son of Re, directly linking his lineage and legitimacy to the paramount sun god. This assertion, seemingly a bold claim of divine right, was, in a subtle yet profound way, a symptom of a growing unease within the very fabric of Egyptian society, an unease that would, within a few generations, unravel the old kingdom into an era of unprecedented darkness. Uzakaf's reign, though marked by significant construction projects, particularly his sun temple at Abusir, began with a whisper of discord, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor beneath the well-ordered veneer of the pharaonic state. For generations, the pharaoh had been seen as the divine embodiment of Horus, the earthly manifestation of cosmic order, the one who ensured the annual flooding of the Nile, the bounty of the harvest, and the prosperity of the land. His pronouncements were law, his will absolute, his position unchallenged. But Uzakaf's shift to son of Re subtly altered this divine equation. While still divine, he was now, in a sense, a step removed, a progeny rather than the direct incarnation. This seemingly minor theological adjustment carried significant implications for the relationship between the king and his people, and more importantly, for the increasingly powerful priesthood of Re, the Old Kingdom, for all its grandiosity and apparent stability, was a delicate balance of centralized power, religious authority, and administrative efficiency. The pharaoh sat atop this pyramid, a living god who commanded the resources of the entire land. His viziers, nomarchs, provincial governors, and countless scribes formed a vast bureaucracy that managed everything from irrigation projects to the distribution of grain. The success of this system hinged on the unquestioning belief in the pharaoh's divine power and his ability to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order and justice. When the Nile flooded reliably, when harvests were abundant, when the granaries were full, this belief was reinforced. But what happened when the sacred river, the very lifeblood of Egypt, began to falter? Uzakaf's reign, while not immediately disastrous, saw the initial signs of what would become a recurring and devastating problem: the irregular flooding of the Nile. For millennia, the annual inundation had been Egypt's greatest blessing, depositing fertile silt and providing water for irrigation. The rhythm of the Nile dictated the rhythm of life. Too low a flood meant parched fields, withered crops, and starvation. Too high a flood meant destruction of villages and infrastructure. The pharaoh, as the orchestrator of Ma'at, was responsible for ensuring the proper flood levels. When the Nile failed, it wasn't just an agricultural crisis, it was a crisis of faith, a direct challenge to the pharaoh's divine legitimacy. Imagine the mounting anxiety in a village along the Nile, the usual signs of the approaching inundation. The rising waters, the distant roar of the current, are muted or absent entirely. Day after day the sun beats down, unyielding. The parched earth cracks. The emerald green of the fields fades to a brittle yellow-brown. The cattle grow thin, their ribs stark beneath their hide. The children's bellies swell with hunger. The priests, who had for so long meticulously observed the cycles of the heavens and the river, offer prayers, but their chants seem to echo hollowly in the stagnant air. In the grand halls of Memphis, the administrative heart of the Old Kingdom, the viziers and scribes would have begun to see the grim reports trickle in from the provinces. Grain requisitions would be unmet. Tax revenues would plummet. The carefully calibrated system of redistribution, which ensured that everyone, from the lowliest farmer to the most exalted noble, received their allotted share, would begin to creak under the strain. For centuries, Egypt had enjoyed a period of remarkable climatic stability, a consistent and generous Nile. This long period of abundance had allowed for the colossal investment in monumental architecture, the maintenance of a vast court, and the complex social hierarchy that defined the Old Kingdom. But this stability was, in hindsight, a fragile gift, dependent on forces beyond human control. Userkaf, with his focus on building a grand sun temple, was perhaps caught between the fading glory of his predecessors and the emerging anxieties of his own time. The resources poured into these lavish projects, while seemingly reinforcing his divine status, may have also strained an already weakening agricultural base. The sheer manpower required for such undertakings meant less labor for crucial irrigation maintenance, less time for planting and harvesting. The bureaucracy, once a finely tuned machine, may have become increasingly focused on extracting resources for the pharaoh's grand designs, rather than ensuring the well-being of the populace. The concept of the pharaoh as the sole intermediary between humanity and the gods, the guarantor of prosperity, was being tested. When the food supply dwindled, when disease began to sweep through communities weakened by malnutrition, who would the people blame? Not just the fickle gods, but the earthly representative of those gods, the very pharaoh who claimed divine parentage. The whispers of discontent, initially suppressed by the overwhelming might of the state, would begin to grow louder, carried on the dry winds that swept across the increasingly arid landscape. This slow, insidious unraveling wasn't a sudden cataclysm, but a gradual erosion of trust, a chipping away at the foundations of a seemingly eternal empire. The grand pronouncements of the pharaoh, the meticulous rituals performed in the temples, all began to ring hollow against the backdrop of empty granaries and the cries of hungry children. The divine legitimacy of the pharaoh, once absolute, now faced its sternest test, and as the Nile continued its unpredictable dance, a question began to hang heavy in the air. a question that would define the coming Dark Age. If the son of Re could not ensure the life-giving flood, what then was his true power? The cracks in the divine facade. The initial whispers of discontent during Yuzakaf's reign, born on the dry winds of an increasingly unpredictable climate, would, in the generations that followed, swell into a chorus of doubt and desperation. While the immediate consequences of Yuzakaf's reign might not have manifested as a full-blown crisis, the subtle shifts in theology and resource allocation he initiated, coupled with the persistent threat of Nile irregularity, laid the groundwork for the devastating famines that would plague the late Old Kingdom and ultimately usher in the First Intermediate Period. To truly understand why you wouldn't survive this Egyptian Dark Age, we must delve deeper into the systemic vulnerabilities exposed by these early tremors. Imagine for a moment the meticulous records kept by the scribes in the granaries of Memphis. For centuries, these records had shown a predictable rhythm of abundance, surpluses carefully stored to tide the population over lean seasons. Now, however, the figures would have begun to tell a grimmer tale. Returns from the provinces, once robust, would be erratic and increasingly insufficient. The careful calculations of supply and demand, the very bedrock of the Old Kingdom's centralized economy, would have become a chaotic mess. This wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a threat to the very social contract that bound Pharaoh to people. The Pharaoh, as the divine steward of Egypt, was expected to ensure the satiety of his people. This wasn't just a benevolent act, it was a fundamental aspect of his legitimacy. The abundance of food was tangible proof of the god's favor and the pharaoh's ability to mediate that favor. When hunger gnawed at the populace, when children cried themselves to sleep with empty bellies, it became difficult, if not impossible, to sustain the illusion of a divinely blessed and perfectly ordered world. One of the most insidious effects of prolonged food scarcity was the weakening of the immune system. You, a common villager, would likely be susceptible to a host of diseases that, in times of plenty, your body could fight off. Dysentery, cholera, typhus. These unseen killers would stalk the communities, claiming the old, the young, and the infirm with merciless efficiency. The archaeological record, though often silent on the direct impact of famine, speaks volumes through the increasing evidence of skeletal abnormalities, signs of malnutrition, and the prevalence of diseases that thrive in weakened populations. Imagine the fear that would grip a village not just from the hunger, but from the sight of friends and family wasting away, their eyes sunken, their skin stretched taut over bone. The local healer, usually able to offer some solace, would find their herbal remedies powerless against the tide of epidemic. Beyond the immediate suffering, famine would shatter the social cohesion of communities. The Old Kingdom, for all its hierarchical structure, relied on a degree of communal cooperation, particularly in agricultural activities and the maintenance of irrigation canals. When resources became scarce, this cooperation would fray. Petty squabbles over dwindling water supplies, disputes over meager harvests, and even outright theft would become commonplace. The carefully maintained order of Ma'at would give way to the chaotic impulses of survival. You might witness your neighbors, once friends, turn on each other with a desperation born of hunger. A chilling preview of the widespread lawlessness that would characterize the first intermediate period. The Pharaoh's court, far removed in its opulent palaces in Memphis, would have initially been insulated from the worst of these effects. The royal granaries, replenished by tribute from the provinces, would have been the last to empty. But even here, the strain would begin to show. The carefully choreographed rituals, designed to reinforce the pharaoh's divine authority, would lose their luster when the offerings to the gods became meager, or when the very subjects meant to benefit from these divine intercessions were dying in the streets. The flow of luxury goods from distant lands, once a steady stream, would slow to a trickle as trade routes became insecure and the economy contracted. More critically, the increasingly powerful nomarchs, the provincial governors, began to assert greater autonomy. In theory, they were the pharaoh's representatives, collecting taxes, managing local affairs, and ensuring the smooth flow of resources to the central government. In practice, as the pharaoh's grip weakened, these nomarchs began to hoard resources, consolidate their power, and in some cases act as independent rulers. When the central government could no longer reliably provide food or protection, local strongmen would step into the void. The loyalty of the people would shift from the distant, seemingly ineffectual pharaoh to the local lord who could, however, imperfectly, provide some measure of security and sustenance. This decentralization of power was a direct consequence of the agricultural crisis. The elaborate administrative machine of the Old Kingdom required a surplus of wealth to function. When that surplus evaporated, the ability of the pharaoh to enforce his will across the vastness of Egypt diminished significantly. The construction of grand pyramids and temples, once a symbol of unified national purpose, would cease. The quarries, once bustling with activity, would fall silent. The skilled craftsmen who had dedicated their lives to serving the pharaoh would find themselves without work, their specialized knowledge slowly fading as their traditions became irrelevant in a world concerned only with immediate survival. The increasing prominence of the cult of Re, championed by Yusukaf, also played a subtle role in this systemic weakening. While initially bolstering the pharaoh's image, it also diverted immense resources and prestige to the temples of Re, particularly the grand sun temples with their colossal obelisks. These temples, unlike the royal mortuary complexes, were dedicated to the cult of a specific deity rather than the pharaoh directly. This shift, combined with the growing power of the priesthood, created an alternative center of power and wealth, gradually eroding the pharaoh's singular authority. When the people looked to the heavens for relief from the famine, their pleas would increasingly be directed not solely to the pharaoh, but to the sun god directly, mediated by the priests who had now gained significant influence. So, as the Nile continued its unreliable dance and the granaries emptied, the magnificent edifice of the Old Kingdom began to reveal its profound cracks. The divine pharaoh, once an unquestionable pillar of stability, was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming just another powerful man struggling against forces beyond his control. The faith of the people, once absolute, was giving way to desperation, and the carefully constructed order of the Old Kingdom was teetering on the brink of collapse. The seeds of the Egyptian Dark Age were not sown in a single catastrophic event, but in the slow, agonizing erosion of trust and resources, leaving a crucial question unanswered. What happens when the very foundations of your civilization, once thought eternal, begin to crumble? The ghost of prosperity and the dawn of disintegration. The slow, agonizing decline that began with the subtle shifts during Usakaf's reign culminated over subsequent generations in a full-blown societal breakdown. You, as an inhabitant of this crumbling empire, would not merely be witnessing history unfold, you would be living its brutal reality, a stark contrast to the stability and prosperity your ancestors had known. The famine was no longer an intermittent threat. It became a pervasive, crushing force, carving deep scars into the landscape and the collective psyche of the Egyptian people. Imagine the sheer psychological toll. For centuries, the Nile's inundation was an article of faith, a divine promise delivered annually. Now that promise was broken. The granaries, once symbols of pharaonic foresight and divine blessing, stood empty, their massive doors gaping like hungry mouths. The elaborate system of corvée labor, once mobilized for grand building projects, was now repurposed, desperately trying to dig deeper wells, clear clogged canals, or simply move people from desiccated regions to areas with a whisper of water, a futile exercise in managing widespread catastrophe. The administrative efficiency that had been the hallmark of the Old Kingdom disintegrated. Scribes, instead of meticulously recording temple offerings and tax revenues, would be tallying the dead, their papyri stained with the tears of a dying nation. The evidence of this widespread suffering is not always found in grand pronouncements or dramatic tales, but in the grim silence of archaeology. The cessation of monumental building projects across the land is a stark indicator. The massive quarries, once echoing with the chisels of thousands of workers, fell silent. The sophisticated workshops that produced exquisite statuary and relief carvings for royal tombs dwindled. This wasn't merely an aesthetic loss, it was an economic collapse. Thousands of skilled artisans, stonecutters, sculptors, painters, and their support staff, who had devoted their lives to glorifying the pharaoh and ensuring his eternal afterlife, found themselves jobless, their unique talents rendered irrelevant in a world where the primary concern was finding the next meal. These individuals, once a vital part of the elite class, would have been forced to return to subsistence farming if land was available, or face starvation. The decentralization of power, initially a gradual shift, accelerated dramatically. The nomarchs, effectively warlords in their own right, carved out increasingly autonomous domains. They built their own fortresses, commanded their own local militias, and collected taxes directly from their subjects. often diverting resources that once flowed to Memphis. Loyalty became a localized affair. Why pledge allegiance to a distant pharaoh who seemingly could not even ensure the basic necessities of life, when a local lord could offer some semblance of protection or a promise of food, however meager? This fragmentation meant internal conflicts became endemic. What began as skirmishes over agricultural land or water rights escalated into full-blown provincial wars, further disrupting trade, agriculture, and communication. The very concept of Ma'at, the divine order, truth, and justice, was profoundly challenged. If the pharaoh, the embodiment of Ma'at, could not maintain cosmic order, then perhaps the gods themselves had abandoned Egypt. This profound theological crisis would have permeated every aspect of daily life. Funerary practices, once meticulously observed to ensure eternal life, would have become simplified, hasty, or neglected entirely as families struggled simply to survive. The elaborate tomb robberies that characterized the first intermediate period were not just acts of greed. They were symptoms of a breakdown in social order and a disregard for the sacred, born out of desperate need. You, as a commoner, would have faced unimaginable choices. Stay in your village and risk starvation, or flee to a city already overflowing. With refugees only to find disease rampant and food scarce, the once secure agricultural communities, tied to the predictable rhythm of the Nile, would be breaking apart. Families would be separated, forced to wander in search of food or safety. The psychological impact of seeing one's entire world unravel, the constant gnawing of hunger, the pervasive fear of disease and violence would have been immense. Survival would demand a ruthless pragmatism, a willingness to shed the societal norms that had defined centuries of Egyptian civilization. The period following Userkaf's reign, known as the First Intermediate Period, is a stark testament to the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations when faced with prolonged environmental and systemic stresses. It was a period of chaos and suffering, a dark age where the central authority of the pharaoh vanished, replaced by competing local dynasties and widespread anarchy. The grand vision of a unified Egypt ruled by a divine king collapsed under the weight of an empty stomach and a broken promise. Yet this dark age also holds a profound lesson in human resilience. While the centralized power structure crumbled, the underlying strength of Egyptian culture, its deep connection to the Nile, and its enduring belief in a divine order, even a fractured one, would eventually allow it to emerge from the ashes. The local rulers, while competing, also preserved elements of Egyptian identity, art, and administration in their own smaller spheres. The hardship forged a new kind of pragmatism and adaptability. The famine of Userkaf and its devastating aftermath serve as a chilling reminder that even the most seemingly immutable empires are ultimately dependent on fundamental resources and a delicate balance of power and belief. The pharaoh's hubris, perhaps in claiming a divinity that transcended the practicalities of governance, combined with the Nile's unpredictable nature, sowed the seeds of a collapse that you would have found incredibly difficult to survive. It was a time when the very concept of being Egyptian was redefined not by grand monuments or divine kings, but by the raw, brutal struggle for existence. What, then, does this period of immense suffering tell us about the true foundations of civilization, and how applicable are those lessons to the modern world's own vulnerabilities? The Great Pyramid's shadow, daily life in a dying empire, echoes in the dust of a colossus. The colossal pyramids of Giza, particularly the Great Pyramid of Khufu, stood as silent, brooding giants in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, but by the time of the late Old Kingdom, and certainly as Egypt plunged into the first intermediate period, these monuments, once vibrant symbols of power and divine connection, cast a far different shadow over the lives of ordinary Egyptians. No longer active construction sites bustling with tens of thousands of laborers, they were for many a stark reminder of a past era of unimaginable wealth and stability, a stark contrast to the increasingly grim reality of their daily existence. To understand why you wouldn't survive this era, it's crucial to grasp the profound shift in the daily grind, the erosion of familiar certainties that these very monuments now seem to mock. Imagine yourself not as a privileged noble or a powerful priest, but as a common farmer, a weaver, or a potter living in the shadow of these architectural marvels. Your ancestors might have toiled on their construction, fed by the royal granaries, proud contributors to a divine king's eternal resting place. But for you, the descendants, the pyramids, were less a source of pride and more a symbol of the resources that were no longer available, the central authority that could no longer provide, the massive integrated system that had built them, the efficient bureaucracy, the massive mobilization of labor, the intricate supply chains, was now crumbling, piece by painful piece. Life in the Old Kingdom, even for the commoner, had a predictable rhythm. The Nile's annual inundation dictated the agricultural calendar, the flood season, Akhet, the planting season, Pere, and the harvest season, Shemu. Your world revolved around these cycles, and the pharaoh, as the embodiment of Horus and the guarantor of Maat, was believed to ensure their regularity. The grain you grew, the animals you tended, a portion of it would go as tax to the pharaoh, but in return, you expected protection, order, and, crucially, a functioning system of redistribution that would ensure your survival even in leaner times. You would have heard tales of the immense wealth of the royal court, but you would also have seen evidence of its benevolent reach, from the provision of seeds to large-scale irrigation projects. However, as the 6th dynasty waned and the first intermediate period began, that rhythm faltered. The Nile's floods became erratic, often too low to properly fertilize the fields, sometimes too high, destroying villages and precious topsoil. The granaries, once overflowing, now held a dwindling supply. The central authority's ability to collect and redistribute grain, the very bedrock of their control, diminished drastically. You wouldn't just be hearing about famine, you'd be living it. Your body would ache with constant hunger. Your children's cries for food would be a daily torment. The simple act of obtaining enough to eat would consume every waking moment. Consider the ripple effect on your everyday tasks. If you were a farmer, the lack of reliable floods meant parched, unproductive land. The traditional tools, the wooden plough, the sickle, remained the same, but the effort yielded less and less. Without a strong central authority coordinating irrigation, your local canals might fall into disrepair, becoming choked with silt or overgrown with reeds. If you were a weaver, the supply of flax would become erratic or too expensive. If you were a potter who would buy your wares when people were struggling to buy basic foodstuffs, the local markets, once vibrant hubs of trade and social interaction, would shrink, filled with desperation rather than commerce. Beyond food, the availability of essential resources would become critical. Wood, always a precious commodity in Egypt, would become even scarcer as trade routes fragmented. Even the simple reeds used for mats or baskets would be harder to come by as wetlands dried up. The ability to repair your simple mud brick home, to replace a broken tool, or to even weave new clothing would be severely hampered. Survival strategies that once relied on communal effort and a functioning state would be replaced by individual or family-level desperation. The social fabric itself would begin to unravel. The village elder, once respected for their wisdom, might now be seen as powerless in the face of widespread suffering. The local temple, once a source of comfort and spiritual guidance, might struggle to maintain its rituals and feed its priests, their gods seemingly silent in the face of so much misery. The once clear lines of authority, from the pharaoh down to the village headman, would blur as local strongmen, often ex-officials or charismatic individuals with access to what few resources remained, began to assert their dominance through force rather than legitimate authority. In this environment, your very concept of security would be shattered. The pharaoh's army, once a formidable force maintaining internal order and protecting borders, was now fragmented, its soldiers often serving local warlords or simply struggling to feed themselves. Bandits and desperate individuals, driven by hunger, would roam the countryside, preying on the vulnerable. The safe passage you once enjoyed along the Nile, essential for trade and communication, would become fraught with danger. You would live with a constant undercurrent of fear of starvation, fear of disease, fear of violence. The great pyramids, symbols of eternity, now bore witness to a society grappling with its very mortality. They stood as a monumental testament to what once was, a stark and silent contrast to the daily struggle for mere existence. And as you looked up at their immutable forms, a profound question would linger in your mind. If even the greatest pharaohs could not protect their people from this kind of suffering, what hope was there for you? The crumbling infrastructure of survival. As the old kingdom crumbled, the shadow of the pyramids stretched longer and darker, no longer merely symbolic, but deeply impactful on the practical realities of everyday survival. The intricate infrastructure that had supported millions for centuries, allowing them to thrive in an otherwise challenging environment, began to fray and ultimately collapse. For you, a common Egyptian, This meant that the familiar, reliable systems that had always been there to cushion the blows of life simply vanished, forcing you to confront a new, brutal reality where every resource was precious and every day a desperate struggle. Consider the water supply, the absolute bedrock of life in Egypt. The Nile's annual inundation, though faltering, still brought some water. However, the sophisticated network of irrigation canals, once meticulously maintained by organized state labor, began to fall into disrepair. Imagine your local canal, once a clean, efficient artery bringing life-giving water to your fields, now choked with silt, overgrown with reeds, and its banks crumbling. Without central coordination, without the manpower and resources to clear them, these essential channels became stagnant ditches. You, a farmer, would find your fields receiving insufficient water or none at all, even when the Nile did bless the land with a decent flood. The communal effort required to clear these canals, once organized by the state, would have to be undertaken by your local village if they had the resources, or simply neglected entirely. This direct impact on water availability meant not just crop failure, but also a surge in waterborne diseases. As stagnant water became a breeding ground for parasites and bacteria. Beyond the fields, daily life would be marked by a relentless scarcity of materials. Think of your simple mud brick home. In better times, repairs were relatively easy. Mud bricks were readily made, and wood, though always somewhat scarce, was available through trade or state allocation for essential construction. Now, with trade, routes disrupted by internal conflict and the state's inability to organize distant expeditions, acquiring even a simple plank of wood for a roof repair or a new tool handle would be a monumental challenge. Pottery, essential for storing water, and grain would become harder to obtain or replace as kilns ran out of fuel or potters, like other artisans, lost their livelihood. Even basic commodities like flax for linen, the staple clothing of ancient Egypt, would be in short supply, leading to threadbare garments and a greater susceptibility to the elements. The economy of the Old Kingdom was largely based on redistribution and a centralized system of tribute and labor. As the pharaoh's power waned, this system crumbled. Money in the form of standardized weights of copper or other valuable materials existed, but bartering would become the dominant form of exchange. You might trade a small amount of your dwindling grain for a cracked pottery jar or a worn-out tool for a few handfuls of dried fish. This return to a more primitive economy meant that specialized skills became less valuable unless they directly contributed to survival. A skilled stonemason, once revered, might find himself starving, while a proficient hunter or a resourceful scavenger might fare better. Security would be a constant, pressing concern. The nomarchs, who had once been loyal governors, were now acting as independent warlords, often engaged in petty squabbles and open warfare with their neighbors. Your village might find itself caught between warring factions, its meager resources plundered by passing armies or roving bands of desperate, hungry individuals. The concept of a universal law enforced by a central authority would have dissolved. Instead, justice, if it existed at all, would be meted out by the local strongman. often arbitrarily and brutally, the security you once enjoyed. The relative peace that allowed for farming and trade would be replaced by a pervasive sense of fear and vulnerability. The social fabric itself would undergo profound changes. The complex hierarchy of the Old Kingdom, with its layers of officials, priests, and artisans, would flatten out, while some nobles might manage to retain their wealth and power within their localized domains. Many would fall into destitution. The very concept of a unified Egyptian identity, once centered around the pharaoh, would fragment. You might identify more strongly with your village or your local nomarch's domain than with the broader two lands. This localized identity, while offering some sense of belonging, also meant a reduced capacity for large-scale collective action or resistance against external threats. Even religious practices, deeply woven into the tapestry of Egyptian life, would adapt to the harsh realities. While belief in the gods would endure, the elaborate temple rituals and grand festivals that required significant state support would diminish. Instead, personal piety and local cults would likely become more prominent as people sought solace and divine intervention in a world that seemed to have abandoned them. Offerings to the gods might become simpler, reflecting the scarcity of resources, and the focus of prayers might shift from cosmic order to immediate survival, a plea for rain, a bountiful catch, or protection from bandits. The Great Pyramid, a monument built with the combined might of a unified and prosperous nation, now stood as a silent witness to a society grappling with its own disintegration. Its very existence served as a chilling reminder of what had been lost, and the daily struggles beneath its shadow underscored a brutal truth. The decline of an empire isn't just about the fall of kings, but the harrowing, relentless struggle for existence for ordinary people like yourself. The basic tenets of civilization, food, water, shelter, security, and order, were all dissolving, leaving a profound question lingering in the dust-filled air. What happens when every single thread of your daily life becomes a battle for survival, the scavenger's hope, and the fading light? As the first intermediate period deepened, the shadow cast by the Great Pyramid was no longer just one of past glory, but of immediate, desperate practicality. For you, the common Egyptian, your daily existence was no longer about contributing to grand projects or adhering to strict social codes. It was about the raw, visceral act of survival, stripped of all former dignities. The pyramid and the numerous other tombs and temples dotting the landscape became a resource, a source of stone for makeshift shelters, a hiding place, or most tragically, a target for desperate plunder. The very notion of eternity, once meticulously crafted in stone, was now irrelevant in the face of immediate hunger. Consider the desperate measures you might take. The official system of redistribution, which had ensured a steady supply of grain even during leaner years, had collapsed. Your small plot of land, if you still had one, might yield little more than a meager harvest due to unreliable floods and neglected irrigation. Therefore, your primary occupation would shift from predictable farming to relentless scavenging. This might involve searching for wild edible plants in the marshes, risking crocodile attacks to fish in the ever more stagnant canals, or even venturing into the desert fringes in search of game, a dangerous endeavor in a land where venomous snakes and scorpions were plentiful. The once clear division between settled agriculturalists and nomadic desert dwellers would blur as more people were forced to adopt a semi-nomadic existence in pursuit of food. The abandonment of the dead was another grim reality. In the Old Kingdom, proper burial and funerary rituals were paramount, ensuring a peaceful transition to the afterlife. Tombs were meticulously prepared, filled with grave goods to sustain the deceased. Now, as hunger and disease ravaged the population, these elaborate practices became impossible for many. Burials would be shallow, hurried, or simply non-existent. The archaeological record from this period shows a marked decline in the quality of burials, with bodies often interred without proper preparation or grave goods. This wasn't a decline in religious belief, but a stark reflection of overwhelming destitution. Moreover, the very tombs of the wealthy, even those of pharaohs, became targets. Tomb robbery, once a heinous crime punishable by death, became rampant. Desperate individuals, driven by the need for any valuable scrap to barter for food, would risk divine retribution and the wrath of local strongmen to plunder ancient burials. If you were truly starving, would you hesitate to chip away at the stone of a long-dead noble's tomb, hoping to find a discarded tool or a forgotten piece of jewelry that could be traded for a handful of grain? Community life would transform. The large centralized villages might shrink or become desolate as people dispersed in search of resources. Smaller, more insular groups would form, prioritizing immediate family and trusted neighbors. Trust once a communal given would become a precious and rare commodity. Any outsider would be viewed with suspicion as a potential threat, a competitor for dwindling resources, or a bandit. This intense localization meant a loss of broader cultural exchange and shared identity. The distinct styles of art and craftsmanship, once uniform across the unified kingdom, would begin to show regional variations, reflecting the isolation and independence of various nomarchs. The political landscape was a brutal testament to this daily struggle. Competing nomarchs, each claiming legitimate authority, would levy taxes on their diminished populations, often in the form of what little food or labor remained. Their rule was often based on brute force rather than divine right. You might find yourself caught in the middle of their petty wars, your meager crops destroyed, your home plundered by one faction or another. There was no overarching law to appeal to, no central authority to protect you. Survival often meant choosing the least oppressive local ruler, or, more accurately, the one whose lands offered the slimest chance of sustenance. Yet amidst this overwhelming darkness, a flicker of human ingenuity and resilience persisted. People adapted. They learned to make do with less, to utilize every available resource, to find alternative food sources. They innovated with simpler tools and techniques, often out of necessity. Though the grand narratives of the Old Kingdom had crumbled, the fundamental spirit of the Egyptian people, their deep connection to the Nile, and their enduring belief in a structured cosmos, however challenged, would prove to be the seeds of eventual recovery. The very desperation forced a re-evaluation of priorities, stripping away the excesses of the past and laying bare the core components necessary for human existence. The Great Pyramid, that magnificent symbol of an age of unparalleled power and belief, endured, but its shadow during the first intermediate period was one of hardship, of broken promises, and of a daily life reduced to its most basic, brutal elements. It was a time when the very concept of living was a triumph, and when the grand narratives of pharaohs and gods gave way to the quiet, desperate stories of countless individuals like you, struggling against the relentless tide of famine and chaos. What then does the endurance of the pyramids, standing silent above this immense human suffering, tell us about the ultimate impermanence of empires and the enduring struggle for survival? The Memphis riots, when the people turned on the gods, the bread, and the blasphemy. Imagine yourself in the sprawling, dust-choked streets of Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, around the late 6th dynasty, as the old kingdom teetered on the How brink. For centuries, this city had been the vibrant heart of the pharaonic state, a place where the king ruled, gods were honored with elaborate rituals, and the granaries of Egypt ensured a steady supply of life's most basic necessity, bread. But by this grim period, the air in Memphis was thick, not just with the scent of incense and the murmur of prayers, but with the palpable tension of desperation, the gnawing ache of hunger. You, a city dweller, perhaps a baker whose ovens were cold, a porter with no goods to move, or a washerwoman with no garments to clean, would feel this tension acutely. The Memphis riots weren't a sudden explosion. They were the culmination of years of systemic failure, of a broken covenant between the divine king and his suffering people. The old kingdom's stability rested on a fundamental, unwritten contract. The pharaoh, through his divine connection, guaranteed ma'at, cosmic order and justice, which manifested in the annual bounty of the Nile. In return, the people offered their labor, their taxes, and their unwavering loyalty. The priesthood, particularly that of Ptah, the patron god of Memphis and creator of the world, and increasingly Re, the sun god, played a crucial role in mediating this divine relationship. They performed the rituals, interpreted the omens, and maintained the elaborate temple complexes that consumed vast amounts of wealth and resources. In times of prosperity, this system worked. The temples, ostensibly spiritual centers, also functioned as major economic hubs, employing thousands, holding vast land endowments, and controlling significant portions of the national grain supply. But as the Nile's floods grew increasingly unreliable and the central authority of the pharaoh weakened, the grand facade began to crack. The famine that had gripped the countryside inevitably crept into the cities, and Memphis, with its dense population, felt its cruelest bite. The city dwellers, unlike the farmers, had no immediate access to land for subsistence. Their lives depended entirely on the state's ability to provide, or at least facilitate trade. When the state faltered, the urban population found itself in a uniquely vulnerable position. Reports would have trickled in from the provinces, accounts of parched fields, of starving villagers, of bandits roaming the increasingly lawless countryside. Initially, these might have been dismissed as regional misfortunes, but soon the direct impact became undeniable. The public granaries, once a symbol of the pharaoh's providence, began to dwindle. The queues for state-issued rations grew longer, and the rations themselves grew smaller, coarser, and less frequent. Imagine waiting for hours under the scorching sun, your stomach cramping, only to be told there was nothing left, or only a handful of stale barley. The anger wasn't just directed at an abstract concept of bad fortune. It was aimed squarely at the visible symbols of power and plenty. The temples, with their vast endowments, their fat priests, and their meticulously preserved offerings to seemingly indifferent gods, became targets of resentment. While the common people starved, the temple granaries filled with offerings for deities who provided no relief seemed an affront. The priests continued their daily rituals, chanting hymns, burning incense, and slaughtering animals for sacrifice, while outside the temple walls, children cried from hunger. The very act of worship, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cruel mockery. This was a profound shift in the people's relationship with their spiritual leaders. For generations, the priests were seen as intermediaries, conduits for divine favor. Now, they were seen as hoarders, beneficiaries of a broken system, perhaps even agents of the gods' displeasure. The pharaoh, the son of Re, was failing, and by extension, the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned their people. This wasn't merely economic distress, it was a crisis of faith, a fracturing of the very worldview that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. The spark that ignites a riot is often unpredictable, but the tinder was everywhere. A shouted insult, a desperate grab for a dropped loaf of bread, a rumor of a hidden cache of grain within a temple compound. Any of these could have been the catalyst. The bread and the blasphemy were intertwined. The lack of bread led to an accusation of blasphemy against a system that claimed divine sanction yet delivered only starvation. The anger, simmering beneath the surface, would inevitably seek an outlet. And in the heart of Memphis, with its grand temples and royal palaces, the stage was set for an unprecedented confrontation. What would happen when the people, once deferential to gods and kings, decided they had nothing left to lose? The temple gates and the fury of the hungry. The simmering resentment in Memphis eventually boiled over. Imagine the scene. The heat of the day, usually softened by the breeze from the Nile, now seemed to press down on the city, amplifying the desperation. The cries of hungry children, once isolated incidents, now formed a mournful chorus. Rumors, always potent in a time of crisis, would have spread like wildfire. Whispers of overflowing temple granaries, of priests feasting behind closed doors while the populace starved. The official channels of redress, petitioning a distant pharaoh or appealing to a local official, had long since proven useless. The time for polite entreaty was over. The focus of the initial surge of fury would inevitably have been the most visible symbols of privilege and plenty, the temples. These were not just places of worship. They were immense economic entities, vast estates with their own lands, granaries, workshops, and considerable human resources. The Temple of Ptah, in particular, as the primary cult center of Memphis, would have been a monument to divine wealth. Its walls, once inspiring awe, now felt like an impenetrable barrier between plenty and utter destitution. You, caught in this burgeoning crowd, might have initially been swept up by the sheer force of collective desperation. It wouldn't have been an organized protest with banners and carefully articulated demands. It would have been a spontaneous, chaotic eruption of primal human need. The cries would have started as pleas for bread, then escalated into angry shouts, and finally, guttural roars of rage. The first stones hurled would not have been aimed with precision, but with frustration, bouncing off the imposing temple walls. The temple guards, likely a small contingent of priests' retainers or local watchmen, would have been quickly overwhelmed. Trained for ceremonial duties, not for riot control, they would have been ill-equipped to face a mob driven by the ultimate motivator: survival. The gates of the temple, usually open to supplicants but now barred against the hungry, would become the focal point of the assault. Imagine the desperate push and shove, the shouts of the crowd mingling with the groans of those crushed in the throng. Crude implements, farm tools, household utensils, even bare hands would be used to pry, hack, and batter at the ancient wood and bronze. Once the gates gave way, the chaos would intensify. The immediate target wouldn't necessarily be the sacred inner sanctums, but the granaries and storerooms. These were the tangible representations of the temple's wealth. The very food that was being denied to the starving. The orderly, meticulous storage of centuries would be ripped apart in moments of frenzy. Sacks of grain would be torn open, their contents spilling onto the ground as people scrambled, fighting over every precious kernel. The sight of food, even spoiled or infested, would trigger a primal feeding frenzy. But the riots weren't just about food. There was an element of profound blasphemy at play, a direct challenge to the authority of the gods and their earthly representatives. Statues of deities, once revered, might have been defaced or toppled, not out of atheism, but out of a desperate, angry questioning. Why have you abandoned us? Why do you feast while we die? The priests, once figures of respect and authority, would have been reviled, their divine authority utterly stripped away in the eyes of the desperate mob. Some might have fled, others might have been caught and subjected to the mob's wrath. Their sacred vestments no protection against the fury of a starving populace. The destruction wouldn't have been limited to the temples. Other symbols of official power and wealth would have been targeted. The residences of wealthy officials and nobles, particularly those associated with the central administration, would be looted. Records and legal documents, once vital to the functioning of the state, might have been destroyed, not out of malice, but out of a desperate attempt to erase the mechanisms of oppression or simply as a byproduct of destructive rage. The very foundations of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, were being violently rejected. The societal norms, the deference to authority, the belief in divine retribution for transgression, all crumbled under the weight of unrelenting hunger. The pharaoh, residing in his palace, would have been effectively powerless. His dwindling royal guard would be insufficient to quell a citywide uprising fueled by despair. The news reaching him would paint a grim picture. The heart of his kingdom, the seat of his power, was in open rebellion. The very citizens he was divinely ordained to protect were now turning on the institutions that represented his rule. This was not a border skirmish or a provincial revolt. It was a crisis within the inner sanctum of the empire. The Memphis riots, while not a singular event but likely a series of violent outbreaks over time, signified a critical turning point. They were a visceral manifestation of the breakdown of the Old Kingdom's core ideologies. The faith in the pharaoh's divine legitimacy, the efficacy of the priests, and the benevolent nature of the gods themselves were all being shattered in the streets of the capital, the silence of the gods, the emptiness of the granaries, and the brutality of starvation had stripped away the thin veneer of order. What happens to a civilization when its people lose faith not just in their rulers, but in the very divine order they believe governs their existence? The ashes of faith and the scars of despair. The immediate aftermath of the Memphis riots would have been a landscape of desolation and fear. The smoke from burning buildings, if any were set alight, would mingle with the dust of crumbling structures. The sacred spaces once inviolable would be desecrated, their contents scattered or plundered. For you, a survivor of the unrest, the immediate danger might have passed, but the deeper scars, the erosion of faith, the utter breakdown of social order would remain. The very heart of the Old Kingdom, its capital, had ripped itself apart, a stark visual representation of the empire's internal decay. The pharaoh's authority, already weakened, would have suffered an irreparable blow. The riots demonstrated in the most brutal fashion that his divine mandate, his claim as the embodiment of Horus, was no longer accepted by a starving populace. His inability to provide food or to maintain order in his own capital stripped away any remaining veneer of legitimacy. The palace, once a beacon of power, would become a place of fear and paranoia, its inhabitants isolated from the very people they were supposed to rule. This immediate loss of central control meant a free-for-all. In the administrative machinery, officials would flee, loyalties would shift, and the intricate bureaucracy that once managed a unified Egypt would simply cease to function. The priesthood, too, would be irrevocably diminished. The attacks on the temples were not just acts of desperation for food. They were a profound rejection of the priests' role as intermediaries to the divine. Their rituals and prayers, once seen as essential to cosmic order, had failed to bring rain or food. Their wealth, once seen as a necessary endowment for the gods, was now perceived as a selfish hoarding in the face of widespread suffering. The EC Respect and fear that once surrounded them would be replaced by resentment and suspicion. Many priests might have abandoned their posts, their temples defiled and their purpose questioned. This decline in priestly power further destabilized the religious landscape, leaving a spiritual void that local cults and personal, often desperate, pleas to the gods would attempt to fill. For the ordinary citizen like you, the most devastating outcome was the complete collapse of social cohesion. The riots shattered the implicit trust that binds communities. Neighbors might have turned on neighbors in the scramble for resources. The fear of violence, looting, and retribution would become a constant companion. Without a central legal system, justice would become arbitrary, meted out by local strongmen or through personal vendettas. The concept of ma'at, once the guiding principle of Egyptian life, would seem like a cruel joke in a world where chaos reigned and survival was the only law. The Memphis riots were not a cause of the first intermediate period, but a powerful symptom of its onset. They signaled the end of the Old Kingdom's unified state and the beginning of a fragmented era where local nomarchs held sway, constantly vying for power, and where large-scale projects, central governance, and even basic security for the populace evaporated. The very concept of Egypt as a single, divinely ruled entity was undone in the streets of its capital. Yet, even in this profound despair, lessons were learned. The trauma of the first intermediate period, marked by such widespread suffering and internal conflict, would eventually breed a deep-seated desire for stability and reunification. The memory of starvation and chaos would fuel the efforts of future rulers to re-establish a strong central government, albeit one with a more cautious approach to divine claims and a greater awareness of the practical needs of its people. The boring details of daily life, the price of grain, the availability of water, the safety of trade routes, would, out of necessity, become paramount in the minds of leaders seeking to restore order. The Memphis riots serve as a stark reminder that even a civilization built on seemingly unshakable divine authority and monumental achievements can crumble when the basic needs of its people are neglected. It illustrates the critical link between economic stability, social order, and religious belief. When the promise of sustenance is broken, the bonds of faith and loyalty can swiftly unravel, leading to a desperate turning on the very institutions once revered. The Great Pyramid continued to stand, a silent sentinel, but its shadow now fell upon a city that had tasted the bitter ashes of a dying empire, forever changing how Egyptians viewed their gods, their rulers, and their own precarious existence. The empty tombs of Saqqara, the business of death in a time of scarcity, eternity undone by hunger. The vast necropolis of Saqqara, stretching for miles along the desert plateau west of Memphis, was once a bustling enterprise dedicated to securing eternity. From the iconic step pyramid of Djoser, the world's first large-scale stone building, to the mastabas and rock-cut tombs of nobles and officials, Saqqara represented the monumental investment ancient Egyptians placed in the afterlife. For centuries, An entire industry thrived around death. Scribes meticulously preparing funerary texts, artisans carving reliefs and painting vibrant murals, embalmers preserving bodies, priests performing elaborate rituals, and countless laborers constructing the tombs themselves. This business of death was a cornerstone of the Old Kingdom's economy and its profound religious beliefs. But as Egypt descended into the First Intermediate Period, the very tombs meant to guarantee eternal life for the elite became symbols of decay, and the intricate industry that supported them crumbled. To truly understand why you wouldn't survive this dark age, consider how even the most sacred aspects of life and death were brutally stripped bare by scarcity. Imagine yourself as a skilled artisan, a painter of tomb reliefs, or a sculptor, crafting exquisite statues for the deceased. In the prosperous days of the Old Kingdom, your skills would have been highly sought after, your work part of a grand divine project. You would have been provided with regular food rations, perhaps even a plot of land, and enjoyed a relatively secure existence. Your identity would have been tied to your craft, your contribution to the king's eternal journey. You might have envisioned your own modest burial, secured by your continued service to the divine order. However, as the central authority of the pharaoh waned, so too did the demand for such elaborate funerary preparations. The famine that gripped the land meant resources, food, timber, precious pigments, skilled labor were diverted from the spiritual to the immediate, from the afterlife to mere survival. The lavish burial provisions that characterized the Old Kingdom, once the bedrock of the funerary industry, became an unaffordable luxury. A noble, struggling to feed his living family, could hardly justify expending vast wealth on a tomb for his deceased ancestors, let alone commission a new one for himself. The immediate impact on the business of death would have been catastrophic. The workshops of Saqqara, once vibrant with the sounds of chisels and the chatter of artisans, would fall silent. The elaborate preparations for mummification, requiring expensive resins, fine linens, and skilled embalmers, would become simplified or entirely neglected. The trade routes that supplied exotic materials for sarcophagi and funerary amulets, cedar from Lebanon, precious stones from distant mines, would have been disrupted by the widespread internal conflict and insecurity. Consider the tombs themselves. In the Old Kingdom, these were not just burial places, they were cult centers, maintained by generations of funerary priests, whose duty it was to ensure the deceased noble's sustenance in the afterlife through daily offerings. These priests were endowed with lands and resources, ensuring their perpetual service. But as the famine bit deeper and the central government's oversight vanished, these endowments dried up. Who would feed the priests when there was barely enough for the living? The funerary cults would have dissolved, the offerings ceased, and the tombs, once cared for, would become abandoned. This abandonment had profound implications. The very purpose of the elaborate tomb, to provide an eternal dwelling and a place for the ka and ba aspects of the soul to return, relied on these sustained rituals and offerings. When they stopped, The spiritual well-being of the deceased was believed to be jeopardized. For the living, it meant a crisis of faith and a direct challenge to the millennia-old belief system. If even the wealthiest and most powerful of ancestors could not secure their eternal repose, what hope was there for anyone else? The vast necropolis of Saqqara, once a testament to enduring faith, would begin to feel less like a sacred landscape and more like an open-air museum of a bygone era. The once feared curses protecting the tombs would lose their power in the face of desperate hunger. The shift from reverence to utter disregard, driven by the brutal realities of survival, would transform the very nature of death in Egypt. What happens to a society when its profound belief in the afterlife, once enshrined in monumental architecture, is undone by the immediate, overwhelming demands of the present, the scavengers, and the desecrated sacred? As the Old Kingdom dissolved into the chaotic First Intermediate period, the very landscape of Saqqara, once a bastion of eternal rest, transformed into something far more grim. The business of death had not simply paused, it had inverted. Instead of being constructed and maintained, tombs became targets. For you, a common Egyptian facing starvation and insecurity, the vast necropolis would have represented a desperate opportunity, a place where the living preyed upon the dead in a brutal reversal of sacred order. Imagine the sheer desperation that would drive someone to such an act. For millennia, the sanctity of the tomb was paramount. Elaborate curses were inscribed on tomb walls, threatening divine retribution against those who dared to disturb the deceased. The fear of these curses, combined with the strong central authority of the pharaoh, had largely protected these resting places. But hunger, the most primal of motivators, eroded both fear and respect. When your child's belly was distended from malnutrition, when your own body wasted away, the wrath of a long-dead god or the threat of a distant pharaoh would hold little sway. Tomb robbery became rampant and systematic. It wasn't just isolated acts of petty theft. Gangs of desperate individuals, sometimes organized by local strongmen or disillusioned former officials, would target tombs. They would break through meticulously sealed entrances, desecrate burial chambers, and strip the mummies of their precious ornaments and grave goods. The elaborate funerary equipment, gold jewelry, precious stones, bronze tools, and even the linen wrappings themselves held immense value in a contracting economy where basic necessities were scarce. These items could be bartered for a few handfuls of grain, a piece of meat, or passage to a more secure region. The physical act of tomb robbery was arduous and dangerous. The robbers faced not only the possibility of being caught and brutally punished, though this risk diminished as central authority crumbled, but also the inherent dangers of collapsing tunnels, hidden pits, and the very real threat of encountering other desperate individuals. The very tools you might use for farming or household chores, a chisel, a rope, a lamp, would be repurposed for this illicit and morally reprehensible activity. The archaeological evidence from this period is stark. Tombs that had remained sealed for centuries were violently opened, their contents scattered, and their mummies often dismembered in the frantic search for hidden valuables. The beautiful reliefs and paintings on the walls, once vibrant scenes of offerings and daily life, would be defaced or damaged in the process. The sheer scale of the plunder suggests that it wasn't just a few rogue individuals, but a widespread phenomenon reflecting the breakdown of law, order, and traditional beliefs. Beyond the valuables, even the materials of the tombs themselves became resources. The finely cut limestone blocks from mastabas, or even the casing stones of larger pyramids, might be quarried and reused for local construction. A new fortress wall for a nomarch, or perhaps even a more substantial home for a desperate family. Timber from tomb roofs, once carefully preserved, would be scavenged for firewood in a land increasingly devoid of trees. The symbolic power of these monuments, once overwhelming, was reduced to their raw material value. The decline in funerary practices for ordinary people was equally profound. The elaborate mummification process, once available to a wider segment of society, became a luxury reserved for the very few, if anyone. Most burials during the first intermediate period are simple, shallow interments, often lacking any grave goods. Bodies might be wrapped in crude linen or simply placed directly into the sand. This was not a change in belief about the afterlife, but a grim reflection of the material impossibility of maintaining the old customs. The very act of mourning and honoring the dead was overshadowed by the relentless struggle for the living. The empty and desecrated tombs of Saqqara stand as silent yet eloquent witnesses to this dark chapter in Egyptian history. They speak not only of material poverty, but of a deep spiritual and social rupture. The grand promises of eternity, once inscribed in stone, were undone by the harsh realities of hunger and lawlessness. The very fabric of Egyptian society, built upon a reverence for the past and a hope for the afterlife, had been torn apart. And as you looked upon these ruined monuments, a chilling question would arise. If even the sacred dead could not find peace, what hope remained for the living? The enduring shadow of the sacred and the seeds of renewal. The desecrated tombs of Saqqara, their emptiness a stark testament to a broken past, were not merely symbols of destruction. They were also silent witnesses to the profound shift in Egyptian belief and practice during the first intermediate period. For you, the common person struggling to survive, the changes in the business of death would have underscored a brutal truth. The sacred was not immune to the earthly realities of famine and chaos. Yet even in this profound desolation, the seeds of future resilience and a renewed understanding of the afterlife were being sown. The most enduring impact of the rampant tomb robbery and the collapse of elaborate funerary practices was a fundamental change in the concept of the afterlife and access to it. In the Old Kingdom, the secure passage to the afterlife was largely tied to the pharaoh's divine power and the meticulous rituals performed by the wealthy elite in their tombs. Royal pyramids and noble mastabas were seen as eternal houses, ensuring the ka and ba of the deceased could return and receive sustenance. When these very tombs were violated and their cults abandoned, it sent a chilling message. The traditional path to eternity was no longer secure, even for the most powerful. This crisis led to a democratization of funerary beliefs, though born out of necessity rather than deliberate theological reform. The old belief that only the pharaoh and those intimately connected to him could achieve true eternal life began to erode. Instead, people began to believe that the afterlife was potentially accessible to a wider range of individuals, provided they lived righteously, adhering to what little remained of Ma'at, and had access to basic funerary texts and spells. This paved the way for the later emergence of the coffin texts, a collection of magical spells and prayers inscribed on the coffins of non-royal individuals, giving them access to the protections and provisions once exclusive to the pharaoh. For you, this meant that while grand burials were out of reach, there was still a slender thread of hope for your own soul after death. A shift from state-guaranteed eternity to a more personal spiritual endeavor. The material culture of death also reflected this change. While large stone tombs became rare, simpler, more accessible forms of burial emerged. Wooden coffins, decorated with the nascent coffin texts, became more common. Grave goods, if present at all, were humble, perhaps a few pottery vessels, simple tools, or amulets. This was not a choice born of prosperity, but of stark necessity, yet it laid the groundwork for the more widespread funerary practices of the Middle Kingdom, where a greater segment of the population could aspire to a secure afterlife. The very landscape of Saqqara, though scarred, held a paradox. While the old tombs were empty and plundered, the fundamental human desire for meaning beyond death persisted. The stories of the violated dead served as grim warnings, but also as a catalyst for new ways of securing eternity. The abandonment of the grand business of death forced a re-evaluation of what truly mattered for the soul's journey. It shifted the emphasis from monumental external display to the internal preparation of the individual, albeit still through magical spells and religious texts. The ultimate lesson from the empty tombs of Saqqara is that even the most deeply ingrained cultural and religious practices can be severely tested by societal collapse. The sacred, it turns out, is not entirely separate from the mundane realities of food, security, and governance. When the state falters and basic human needs are not met, even the sanctity of death can be undone. However, the period also highlights the enduring human spirit's capacity to adapt and innovate, finding new pathways to meaning and hope, even amidst profound despair. The emptiness of those great tombs whispered a warning about the fragility of empires built on grand claims, while simultaneously hinting at the quiet, resilient ways in which a civilization can reinvent its most cherished beliefs. The Nile's betrayal when the lifeline became a grave, the fickle artery of life. For millennia, the Nile River was not just a river, it was the lifeblood of Egypt, a divine gift that annually renewed the land with its fertile silt and life-giving. Waters, the very rhythm of Egyptian civilization, was dictated by its predictable inundation. Settlements clustered along its banks, sustenance flowed from its annual bounty, and the pharaoh himself was considered the ultimate guarantor of its benevolent flow. But as Egypt descended into the first intermediate period, this sacred relationship was brutally severed. The Nile, once the unwavering source of prosperity, became a fickle, treacherous force, transforming from a lifeline into a grave for countless Egyptians. To truly grasp why you wouldn't survive this era, you must understand how this fundamental betrayal, more than any human failing, crippled a civilization. Imagine yourself as a farmer, your life meticulously calibrated to the Nile's pulse. Your existence depended on the Akhet, the season of inundation, when the river swelled, overflowing its banks and depositing the rich black silt that fertilized your fields. You knew when to expect the rising waters, when to plant your seeds in the receding mud, and when to harvest the ripened crops. This annual cycle was not merely agricultural, it was spiritual, a profound reaffirmation of Ma'at, the cosmic order maintained by the gods and the pharaoh. Your faith in the system and your very survival hinged on the Nile's predictable generosity. However, during the late Old Kingdom and into the First Intermediate Period, this predictability vanished. Evidence from geological studies and ancient nilometers, devices used to measure the flood levels, points to a prolonged period of unreliable and crucially significantly lower floods. This wasn't a one-off bad year. It was a generational crisis. Imagine waiting anxiously on the riverbank, day after day, for the promised swell of water that never came, or came only as a meager trickle. The usual signs, the darkening of the water, the distant roar of the current, the subtle rise, would be absent or terrifyingly weak. A low Nile flood meant catastrophe. Without sufficient water, the irrigation canals, painstakingly dug and maintained by centuries of communal labor, remained dry or barely filled. Your fields, once lush and green, would crack and turn to dust. The precious black silt, the very foundation of Egyptian agricultural success, would not be deposited, leaving the soil infertile. The crops, barley, emmer wheat, flax, would wither and die in the relentless sun. The staple food of Egypt, bread, would become an unimaginable luxury. The immediate consequences of a failed flood were swift and brutal. Starvation would sweep through communities. Livestock, without fresh grazing or water, would perish, further decimating the food supply. People would grow weak, their bodies susceptible to disease. The very sight of a child with a swollen belly and stick-thin limbs, once rare, would become tragically common. Survival would depend on finding any edible wild plants, or perhaps resorting to desperate measures like consuming the husks of grain, or scavenging for roots. The impact extended beyond the fields. The Nile was also the primary artery of trade and communication. Boats laden with grain, stone, or administrative decrees would find themselves stranded in shallow waters or unable to navigate choked channels. This meant that even if one region had a slightly better harvest, the ability to transport that food to a starving neighboring area would be severely hampered. The centralized economy, which relied on the smooth flow of goods and information, would grind to a halt. The pharaoh's ability to collect taxes or dispatch troops would be severely diminished, further eroding his authority and contributing to the rise of independent nomarchs. The psychological toll of the Nile's betrayal would have been immense. For a people whose entire worldview was shaped by the river's life-giving power, its failure was a direct challenge to their deepest beliefs. It felt like a betrayal by the gods themselves, or by the pharaoh who claimed to mediate their blessings. The constant, gnawing uncertainty, the fear that each year the life-giving waters might not return, would have been a profound source of despair. The sacred river, once the symbol of eternal life, was now becoming a symbol of death and desolation. How could a civilization built entirely on the beneficence of a river survive when that river turned against it? Disease, migration, and the water wars. The Nile's betrayal manifested in persistent low floods, rapidly cascaded into a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions, far beyond simple hunger. For you, the ordinary Egyptian, the river's unreliable flow meant not just starvation, but a constant gnawing fear of disease, the agony of forced migration, and the brutal reality of conflict over dwindling water resources. The very lifeline was now an agent of death and disorder. Imagine your community, once vibrant and productive, now suffering from chronic malnutrition. Your body, weakened by lack of food, would be profoundly susceptible to illness. The diseases that had always been present in Egypt, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, parasitic infections, would erupt into devastating epidemics. With less water to properly irrigate fields, the remaining water sources would become stagnant and contaminated. People, desperate for any liquid, would drink from foul pools, exacerbating the spread of waterborne pathogens. The Old Kingdom's advanced medical knowledge, impressive for its time, would be powerless against the sheer scale of the outbreaks. You would witness friends and family members succumb rapidly, their suffering compounded by hunger and the inability to find adequate care or clean water. The lack of proper burials, as discussed in the previous story, would also contribute to public health crises, as bodies often lay unburied or were shallowly interred, attracting vermin and spreading disease. As the land dried up and crops failed year after year, communities would face an agonizing choice: stay and starve, or migrate in a desperate search for water and food. This forced displacement would have been a profoundly traumatic experience. Imagine leaving behind generations of ancestral land, your mud brick home, and all familiar landmarks, with no certainty of finding anything better. These migrations would often be unorganized, desperate movements of families and small groups, often along the riverbanks, where the slimmest hope of sustenance remained. These displaced populations, weakened and vulnerable, would further strain the resources of any areas they stumbled upon, leading to increased tensions and conflict. The concept of water wars might seem a modern one, but in ancient Egypt, when the Nile was the sole source of life, control over water was literally a matter of survival. As the floods diminished, disputes over access to canals and remaining fertile patches of land would escalate into violent conflicts. Local communities, once part of a unified state, would turn on each other. Nomarchs and local strongmen would raise their own militias, not just to assert political power, but to secure vital water sources. You might find your village caught between warring factions, its few remaining wells or irrigation channels becoming battlegrounds. The meticulous system of nilometers, once used to record and predict floods for agricultural planning, would now serve as grim indicators of dwindling resources, perhaps even becoming strategic points of control for those desperate to hoard the last vestiges of life. The once flourishing urban centers, like Memphis, would become increasingly overcrowded with refugees from the countryside, exacerbating the scarcity of food and clean water within the cities themselves. The sewage systems and basic sanitation that existed in these cities would be overwhelmed, creating further breeding grounds for disease. The social order within cities would fray, leading to more incidents of unrest and violence, as seen in the Memphis riots. The pharaoh's impotence in the face of the Nile's betrayal was perhaps the most damaging blow to his divine authority. He was meant to ensure the prosperity of the land, to mediate with the gods for the life-giving inundation. When the inundation failed, it was a direct failure of his divine mandate. This profound disappointment in the king led to a complete loss of faith in the centralized system. People felt abandoned by both their earthly and heavenly rulers. The archaeological record, though often silent on the direct details of these sufferings, speaks volumes through the shift in settlement patterns, the decline in population numbers, and the evidence of widespread malnutrition in skeletal remains. Entire regions that had once supported thriving communities would become depopulated, returning to the desert. The Nile, in its refusal to rise, had not just caused famine, it had fundamentally reshaped the landscape of human habitation and the very fabric of Egyptian society. What happens when the very essence of a civilization's existence, its source of life, becomes the primary cause of its death? The enduring scar and the rebirth of adaptation. The relentless low floods of the Nile during the first intermediate period carved an indelible scar onto the Egyptian landscape and the collective memory of its people. The river, once the benevolent provider, had exposed the ultimate vulnerability of a civilization built entirely on its bounty. For you, the ordinary Egyptian who survived this era, the Nile was no longer just a source of life. It was a potent reminder of the fragility of existence and the deceptive nature of divine favor. Yet, this profound crisis also forced a brutal, transformative adaptation that would ultimately allow Egypt to rise from the ashes of despair. The most critical long-term impact was the re-evaluation of the pharaoh's divine role. The Old Kingdom concept of the pharaoh as the living Horus, the direct orchestrator of the Nile's flood and the guarantor of Maat, was shattered. How could a divine king allow his people to starve? This crisis of faith paved the way for a more nuanced understanding of kingship in the subsequent Middle Kingdom. Future pharaohs would still be seen as divinely appointed, but their legitimacy would increasingly hinge not just on their lineage, but on their actual ability to govern, to ensure the welfare of their people, and to manage the resources of the land. The boring details of irrigation maintenance, grain storage, and administrative efficiency would become paramount, directly linking a ruler's success to the physical well-being of his subjects. The widespread migrations and the collapse of the central administration also led to localized resilience and innovation. Communities, cut off from central support, were forced to become self-sufficient. They would have developed new strategies for water management, perhaps digging shallower wells, conserving every drop, and adapting their agricultural practices to less water-intensive crops, if possible. The very act of survival, stripped of grand pharaonic oversight, fostered a spirit of practical problem-solving at the local level. While the loss of centralized knowledge meant the abandonment of some complex Old Kingdom techniques, the necessity of invention spurred new, localized solutions. The social and political landscape was permanently altered. The power of the nomarchs, born out of the pharaoh's weakness, would endure even after reunification. While the Middle Kingdom would re-establish a strong central authority, it would do so by integrating these powerful local lords into the new administrative structure, recognizing that distributed power, managed correctly, could provide greater regional stability. The memory of chaos would temper the ambition of future pharaohs, encouraging them to maintain a more balanced relationship with their provincial governors. The Nile's betrayal taught Egyptians a harsh lesson about environmental dependency. The Ai River, once seen as an infallible source of life, was now understood as a powerful, unpredictable force that required constant human management and respect. This fostered a deeper understanding of the vital importance of irrigation infrastructure and centralized efforts to maintain it. When reunification finally came, a major focus would be on restoring and expanding the network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, a testament to the painful lessons learned during the Dark Age. The silence of the Nilometers during years of low flood, and their subsequent records of returning bounty, marked a profound shift. The river, once a silent, divine benefactor, became a more tangible, sometimes terrifying entity that demanded human effort and foresight. The Nile's betrayal, therefore, was not just a historical event. It was a defining crucible for ancient Egyptian civilization. It stripped away the illusion of immutable divine order and forced a raw encounter with existential vulnerability. The memory of those low floods, of starvation, and of the river becoming a grave would forever influence how Egyptians viewed their land, their gods, and the very nature of governance. What happens when the fundamental lifeblood of a civilization nearly ceases to flow? And how does that near-death experience fundamentally reshape its future?